Thank you. So we are recording and this is the January 12th ACTL meeting. Okay, thank you. All right, Bridget.
Thank you, Bethany. And hello, everybody. Happy New Year to you. Happy to see everybody on screen and appreciate you coming out tonight. I put the website information about what I'll be talking about in the chat. So you've got the link there. What I'd like to do is kind of give you some background as to how we landed on our plan to ensure that students are accessing instruction should they have to quarantine either because they're sick or because they're a close contact. Then I'll do a quick review of the plan, and I want to thank Jason in particular. He posed several questions that folks may be thinking about, so I'll sort of talk through those questions, and then Bethany, I'll forward you the narrative so that you can include those in the minutes if you'd like. So that's kind of my thinking. And Bethany, I've got what do I have until, so I can time myself?
We have for this until 7:25.
Okay, all right. So let me start a little bit with the background, and then we'll kind of go through the plan. We're taking ourselves back to sort of the July, August, early September timeframe, in which we, as a system, we were anticipating, but not quite clear on sort of the volume of students who may have to quarantine due to exposure to COVID. At that point, we had some of our kids eligible for vaccines, and we're looking forward to having more of our kids eligible for vaccines, but understood that this would be likely a rolling risk exposure scenario. And so I worked with principals, I worked with members of the Office of Academics, folks from school support, and then representatives from our Teachers Council on Instruction to really think about how can we both make it possible for students who have to quarantine for up to 10 days to access instruction while they're gone from in-person learning, and feasible for our teachers to kind of maintain that because we anticipated and are seeing, you know, teachers can have a range of one of their students being absent to, you know, more than half their class being absent. And if secondary teachers may have a variety of those scenarios in each of the courses that they teach. So that was, those were really sort of the two paradigms that we were thinking about. We also took into account that we've got quite a spectrum when we think K-12 of student readiness and sort of capacity to be able to access instruction and the supports that they might need. Certainly our kindergartners are going to need more support to access instruction remotely than perhaps our 11th and 12th graders. Also looking at the range of content requirements. So again, I'll come back to a first grader accessing a sort of literacy instruction versus a student who's enrolled in chemistry. So quite a variety and range in content. And then also pedagogy, so the delivery of that content and the differences there. So those were sort of the paradigms that we were using as we were thinking about how do we sort of meet an unknown. And we took a look at our surrounding districts and the plans that they were beginning to develop, paid special attention to Alexandria. They were a little bit of ahead of us at the time, and so that was a really good template. And then certainly looked at Fairfax and Loudoun as well, and Falls Church. So we landed on, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Oops, I'm sorry, the host has disabled participant screen sharing. So I'm wondering if maybe, Bethany, I'm allowed to do that?
Try it now, please. Go ahead.
If I, okay, let me give it a shot. Fantastic. Great. And there we go. Thank you. So just so that everybody can see what I'm sharing here. And again, this is the link that I posted in the chat. So you can see that this information is coming from our web site. It's, you've got a little bit of information at the top, which talks about our priority to provide in-person instruction 5 days a week. And but an acknowledgement that kids are going to likely have to quarantine. And where we landed on was independent asynchronous learning activities. And we did that on purpose because, again, trying to ensure feasibility and access, and recognizing that our teachers are balancing the needs of their kids who are in person and the needs of their students who have to quarantine. And so the additional preparation that would be required for sort of both of those platforms, the in-person synchronous learning and then the asynchronous. So, and then we're focusing on power standards, and really because those are really the must-knows for our students. And for those kids who are enrolled in SOL courses, they'll be assessed at the end of year on those power standards, and those power standards build vertically as well. So that's really the focus of the asynchronous learning activities. So we also, in thinking about feasibility and that range of access, we landed on sort of 3 different platforms, right? So kids can access a limited live stream instruction, which basically allows them to view and listen to their teacher providing that instruction, and that there's no expectation that they're going to engage or that the teacher will engage with them, but that they can see and hear what's happening. And so if you come back to that example of a chemistry class, might be really important for a kid to be able to observe a lab that's going on. And that student is likely a 10th grader and 11th grader and can kind of manage their technology on their own and sort of self-direct more so than perhaps a kindergartner. So a kindergartner might be much more able to access some recorded mini lessons that are linked to those power standards. So going to their teacher's Canvas page and being able to access those lessons and listen to the lesson and perhaps engage in that way. Or we also have the collaborative work via Canvas and Google tools. So it could be that students are assigned to group work, and that the child at home is engaging with kids who are in person, and they're collaborating through those tools that allow them to do some real time work. So you might think about editing or group editing essays, for example, would be an opportunity for them to do some collaborative learning. So again, it's up to the teacher, and it's really based on student sort of age and readiness, capacity, the content, and the pedagogy. We did want to emphasize that if kids are doing this because are quarantined and they're sick, they're likely not going to be able to access instruction. We want them to focus on getting well. And so we really wanted to convey to parents that they were the ultimate arbiter as to whether or not their child would be able to access that those lessons, and they really should make that decision based on that the child's capacity to do so. Could be too that students who are quarantining may be spending time with a babysitter and don't have the access to technology that they might at home or to Wi-Fi, and so it needed to be as flexible as possible. So really the intention is for kids to sort of keep a pace with their classmates, to focus on those broad range power standards, and to have some flexibility as it relates to ongoing access based on their health and their particular circumstance. We also recognized, as we talk about differentiating, we recognize that our pre-K kids are in a very different learning space and sort of readiness than even our Ks, but certainly K through 12. And so you can see that there is some real differentiation for our pre-K kids. And so you'll notice the choice board that has 7 days of activities. And throughout this chart, we want to give a nod to that our students with disabilities have accommodations, and those need to be supported through these asynchronous learning activities as well. So you see, as we go through the chart, we've got the student learning on one side, and then we've got the support. And so the expectation for our pre-K kids is that teachers are going to conduct those virtual check-ins with families, right, or calls. If we've got one or a few kids in a class, that's going to happen daily. If it's the whole class, then the check-ins and calls will happen within the first 2 days of the quarantine. And then if the whole class needs to quarantine, then the class is going to transition to full virtual learning. And we're certainly fortunate that our students have those devices so they can do that as well. You see a nod, and that's repeated in our other boxes about students who get support from related service providers can also continue to work with those providers while they're on quarantine. So then you see the difference in this is pre-K students, when individual students have to quarantine, and then if the whole class has to quarantine, this is what's going to happen here. I'm getting dinner delivered. Thank you, sir. So for the whole class, for days 1 and 2, the students will focus on asynchronous activities, and then starting on day 3, we'll move forward to the synchronous via Teams, right? And it kind of shows you on the right-hand side how kids will access that. So then let's move to K-12. Again, when individual, and when we say individual students, it could be one, it could be half the class. So we're really trying to sort of differentiate between individual kids and then what happens when the whole class has to quarantine. So we definitely recognize that our elementary students will be missing the community of the class. And so we thought it was important that they access that live stream morning meeting. And we landed on day 3. And that was really because we were beginning, when we finalized this is the early weeks of the school year, we were beginning to recognize that kids at that point might have been a close contact, might have to quarantine, but then able to have a negative test and come back fairly quickly. And so really kind of landed on that feasibility. All right, if a kid's quarantined on day 3, then we know they're likely going to be quarantined for the long haul. And so we want to be able to put these options in place. If they're quarantining for 1 or 2 days, each teacher's got their own process and expectations on how a student might keep abreast of what's happening. So you've got the 3 options sort of described here. We've got the asynchronous activities aligned to power standards that are in the Canvas course, and then of course the accommodations that are being accommodated. And you'll see here that kids should know already which one of these platforms the teacher's using. Is it the secured live streaming, the mini lessons, or the collaborative group work? But then we expect also that once it becomes real for a kid and they've got a quarantine, then they would be notified by the teacher, right? We've got the teachers are updating Canvas, and then they're responding to questions, right? So you can expect within 2 school days, if you have a question, then this is what the teachers are going to be doing. We also recognize there's a social emotional piece to this. So the member of the school student support team, and that could be the student's counselor, likely at the secondary level, a social worker, a psychologist, is checking in with the kid to make sure that about their well-being. And then you see the work of the case carrier, right? So many of these things hold true when the whole class quarantines. with the exception that everybody's going to be doing live synchronous instruction via Microsoft Teams, right? So you see that described there. And then what happens if a teacher has to quarantine? And we're certainly seeing that phenomenon as we come back from break with the surge of the Omicron virus variant. And so we expect that if the teacher has to quarantine and is well enough to do so, they'll deliver instruction via Microsoft Teams when possible. The sub can pin the teacher on the smart board so kids can access it. And they can access it from the classroom without even signing into Microsoft Teams, which then doesn't tax our Wi-Fi as much as we saw that it did back in the spring. You'll still see they're updating their Canvas course and that special ed teachers are checking in as well. So that's the process. Yeah, Bethany, I see I've got about 4 minutes. Can I talk about or address some of the questions that were posed ahead of time? Is that okay?
Yes, we had one question that was put in the chat while you were speaking. So maybe we could pivot to that quickly. And then
Sure.
if you had additional, yeah, and that was about students with disabilities who are unable to access asynchronous activities without adult support.
Right. And that's, I think, really where the case carrier and the IEP team come into play, right? And so it could be likely, and we would expect some proactivity if case carriers understand the students on their caseload who may not be able to access those asynchronous activities, that they're beginning some forward planning before the child has to quarantine. But if that wasn't able to happen, then we would expect that the IEP team could come together relatively quickly, either during the quarantine period or right after, to address what learning was missed, how that might be delivered, if the child might be eligible for some limited compensatory services, to move forward to ensure that we're not just leaving that lost learning opportunity lie. And I see from Wendy Pizer, when students in quarantine are learning from home, as I described, will they be marked present for attendance purposes? There is actually, we have a specific attendance codes for students who are quarantining for COVID. And so that we'll use those attendance codes. Again, we are not requiring students to access learning while they are quarantined, because we're not, we can't decide wholesale about their health or their particular abilities to access these asynchronous activities based on their environment or their capacity to. So thank you, David, and I appreciate that. Certainly we'll follow back up. David says in the chat, he'd be floored if IEP teams are proactively planning for future quarantines, and says that's absolutely something that we can take back to our student support coordinators and work with Kelly Krug and Heather Rothenbuscher to really find out. And if it's not happening, certainly while we're in the surge time, we need to be doing some thinking about that. So I've got a minute left. You want me to try?
Yeah, so yeah, if you want to go to any of the other questions that we had put.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the questions was, why is instructional support not available before day 3 of the quarantine, and how can kids access that content on days 1 and 2, right? So I talked a bit about the planning and preparation required for teachers to set up the live streaming of lessons or to pre-record the mini lessons, and putting that time and attention into it while also balancing the planning and prep for their in-person students. We really felt, working with principals and teachers, agreed that that sort of day 3 is sort of the threshold when we recognize that the kid's going to be probably a long haul quarantine student, as opposed to a student who might be out for another reason in day 1 and 2. And so we felt that teachers do have mechanisms for kids to be able to access instruction on days 1 and 2. And so that's where we landed on 3. And I should say those mechanisms on day 1 and 2, as they are for all things, is to be able to access Canvas or the teacher seesaw course as well. We do also expect that teachers should have communicated these procedures. The other question, another question that was asked is, could teachers communicate their plans for instructional support during this week, right, as kids are coming back? And so we did remind principals of our APS plan, because remember, this came back out in September. And so we've proactively appointed principals back to this plan. And then we send out a weekly message, we meaning academics, as part of Dr. Duran's weekly message to staff. And we prompted them, actually, Dr. Duran sent a message on January 5th. So we prompted them then. And then today we prompted them again that they should be thinking about these plans and communicating them with their students. So I'll pause there. Again, Bethany, I can send you the narrative of the responses to the questions so you've got them, but I'm a minute over. So
thank you, I appreciate that. Let me ask you to go quickly to Dima's question in the chat.
Okay.
Is that if a teacher has already prepared material for students on day 1 and 2 in any case, so wouldn't a student be able to access, and maybe that would be more for middle or high school students, where things would be posted on Canvas for students
Sure.
to access.
Right. It's not a hard and fast rule that kids may not access learning on days 1 and 2. What we really wanted to differentiate was that limited live streaming is likely not going to occur on day 1 and 2. Recorded mini lessons may not occur, could if the teacher posted them, but may not occur on day 1 and 2. But always teachers should be institutionalizing that students go to Canvas to access their missed work. And so it wouldn't surprise me, it wouldn't be unusual for teachers to be posting that work on Canvas so that students can access that on day 1 and 2.
Okay, thank you. That was a lot of information in a short period of time. I do think there are additional questions. And so I think if folks have more questions, send me an email and I can, try to compile additional questions if we want to try to, see where those answers can be found for you all. We really want to make sure that families feel like they understand like what the plan is and what is supposed to happen if their child is quarantined for any length of time. I would just offer Bridget the observation that when I read through the plan, some of the things seem a little bit more aspirational than they do, like they necessarily will happen. So I'm looking at the item about a member of the school's student support team will check in with students about their well-being. Well, that certainly seems like something that would be reasonable to expect when you had like maybe 5 kids in a school who were in quarantine back in September. But when you have much more significant numbers of students and you have both students who are in person and students who are learning in quarantine, I wonder the extent to which, and a flow of students who are out for 5 days and then somebody else starts the next day and somebody else, whether or not that particular item, for example, is one that parents and students can really sort of count on, as opposed to it maybe is what we hope will happen under the best circumstances, but we are not in the best circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree when we look at volume, right? That said, we had counselors as part of the T-scale review, and we did also check with directors of counseling at the secondary level. So, but that's a good point. I see Wendy Pilch, my colleague from Student Support, is on that. It's a good point to bring back to our docs and to our director of counseling to check in and see if that's still feasible. And if it's not, then we need to edit our plan. So.
Right. I just think it's helpful for families to really be able to understand what to expect, right? And not feel like there were things that they were thinking were going to happen that clearly just in the current moment are not going to happen. Or for us to say, no, it really is unbelievably critical that something happened and we really need to know that it's going to happen. You know what I mean? So it sort of goes both ways, right? Okay, thank you. I am going to move us along because I'm now putting us behind schedule. Thank you, Bridget, for taking that and doing that overview for us this evening. I do want to pivot to our committee reports, and I'm going to quickly, for everyone, reiterate a little bit of what I said in the email when I sent out the agenda at the beginning of the week. This is a really important part of our process for sort of continual improvement within APS, and we want to make sure that the reps from our schools and community organizations engage with the reports and the recommendations and the thinking, the conversations that are happening in our sort of subject and content focused area committees. And we have a process also. So I did send out to everyone the rubric that we have designed for this year for reviewing recommendations and giving them an endorsement from each of the sort of the voting representatives from the schools. And if you have any questions about that, let me know, and I'll tell you whether you are or not a voting representative from a school or community organization. It's my view that reps who are appointed from schools should feel empowered to fill out that rubric and assess the recommendations based on reading the report and being part of the conversation. But I do offer everyone a week of time following the conversation so that if you feel like you do want to consult with members of your school community or your organization, you can do that. So I also noted in the sort of instructions that I sent earlier this week that we do want everyone to fill out a rubric for each recommendation of each committee. So there's lots of rubrics that are going to be sent to me via email by next Wednesday for the 3 committees and their recommendations for this evening. And then a final piece is that some folks who've been reps in the past or come back on as reps will remember that there were times when we would rank committee recommendations. We would take all the committee recommendations and rank them. We are not doing that this year. We are simply doing a simple endorsement, strongly endorse, or endorse with reservations, or a do not endorse, and that's on the bottom of the rubric. So when you turn in the rubric, that will then we'll compile that into a report to the school board at the end of the year. So let me pause and just see if there's any questions. I see, Rachel, are the other committee chairs voting members? It is my understanding from reading the rules from the past that they are not, that it's just the reps from schools and community organizations that are the voting members. That is something, though, that we I'm going to seek to address and spell out more clearly in the upcoming PIP, policy implementation procedure for ACTL. So, but based on past practice, the other committee members are not voting members. Okay, with that, I want to move us along. So we will turn to Meredith Jekyll, who is the chair of the Early Childhood Advisory Committee. And I know she has staff here as well, and probably some committee members. So Meredith, I'm simply going to let you take it away.
Thanks, Bethany. Yep, I see several members of our committee here. I'm grateful to see their smiling faces as well as our staff liaisons. As Bethany said, my name is Meredith Jekyll. I'm the chair of the Early Childhood Advisory Committee, and our committee is tasked with generating recommendations that benefit our youngest learners, which is our pre-K through grade 2. Some people are under the impression that early childhood only addresses our preschool students, but we go pre-K through 2. You all received a copy of the recommendations in Bethany's email, so I'll spare you from me reading them again to you, but I would like to articulate, as Bethany said, some of our thinking around these recommendations. Our first is we're asking the school board to reverse the new class size increases. We're hearing from teachers and parents that students are returning to in-person learning with challenges that didn't exist before the pandemic. Children are facing delays in their social and emotional development, as well as learning loss from their year plus at home. APS teachers are reporting that many of our youngest students, some of whom are so young that they don't remember school before the pandemic. They're coming to school not yet ready to attend and learn. Teachers are spending vastly more time supporting social and emotional learning than ever before, and are struggling to find time for academic instruction, to say nothing of remediating learning losses. In a minute, we're going to discuss the new English Language Arts Initiative, which will shift APS's literacy instruction from balanced to structured literacy. More students per classroom makes it difficult for teachers to differentiate learning, particularly for literacy instruction. In short, students have greater needs, while at the same time, more students are being added to classrooms. This is a recipe for unmet needs among our students and burnout among our teachers. Our second recommendation asks to fully fund 2 special education early childhood classroom assistants for each pre-K classroom. The Early Childhood Advisory Committee has long commended early childhood special education for offering a robust spectrum of inclusion opportunities at the preschool level. In fact, our 2019-2020 recommendation encouraged APS to extend a similar array of inclusion opportunities at the elementary level. However, high quality inclusion programming requires adequate staffing. In just the first quarter of this year, there have been 8 separate requests for additional staffing in early childhood special education classrooms. Without additional staff members, it's difficult to ensure the safety of all students, make certain that students are getting the support necessary to meet their IEP goals, and facilitating meaningful inclusion opportunities. As I previously mentioned, our last recommendation relates to the move to structured literacy, a move that our committee wholeheartedly endorses. We know that high quality instructional materials are necessary, but not sufficient to ensure that students have access to an equitable and excellent education rooted in the science of reading. APS must provide ongoing job-embedded professional learning so that our teachers have the mindsets, knowledge, and skills to effectively implement structured literacy. In other words, it's critical to our long-term efforts to close opportunity gaps that APS consistently build teacher capacity as highly knowledgeable and effective literacy teachers. We need literacy champions in our buildings. What we're envisioning, with input from teachers on our committee, is a school-based literacy coach. This person would be an instructional leader that is a champion for equitable teaching practices, an advocate and resource for teachers, and an expert practitioner who is working side by side to support teachers and students, providing real-time modeling of high-quality, evidence-based literacy instruction. This shift to structured literacy requires a shift not just in practice, but also in mindset. This school-based literacy champion is a change agent, ensuring that this massive time and financial investment of purchasing high-quality structured literacy materials builds excellent and sustainable literacy instruction for years to come. That is a brief summary of our recommendation and echoes the points that we made when we presented this recommendation to the school board back in November. And Bethany, I turn it back to you if anybody has any questions for our committee.
Thanks, Meredith. That was terrific. And as you all know, we did talk about structured literacy in one of those months in the fall when we were all here together. I think it was November. And we will hear more about that also from the English Language Arts Committee at the next meeting, I think. So yes, any questions or comments or anything you would like sort of clarified about the recommendations from the Early Childhood Committee? You got a bravo, Meredith, in the chat.
Thank you, Kelly. We'd love to have a conversation about the recommendations. We're anxious for them to be as high quality as possible. So we look forward to hearing from the community.
I had just a general, sorry, hold on a second.
You're echoing. Jason, do you want to put it in the chat?
Sorry about that. I had to join on my phone for audio, so, and I forgot. So anyway, sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. On the class size recommendation, Meredith, did you guys get a little more specific about, or is it about holding the line, or are you actually talking about potentially reducing certain class sizes? Just sort of asking that more general question.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, Jason. So I'm not great at recalling data, so I'm gonna pull it right from my report. So the last full school year before the pandemic, which was 2018, 2019, the class sizes and for elementary school were 24 kids in K to 1, 26 for 2 to 3, and then 28 to 4 to 5. And then this year, in a move that was initiated several years ago, but went into place this year, now K1 is 28. 26 for K1, 28 for 2-3, and 30 for 4-5. So specifically what we were asking was for them to revert back to the class sizes that existed prior to the pandemic, which would have been the 2018, 2019 class sizes.
And you know what's so interesting, Bridget, I don't know if you are, Bridget's probably actually eating her dinner, which would be a good thing. But I heard, I think just today from, yes, it was in a meeting, my 5 o'clock meeting today, about the class size report, which indicated that in fact, the largest current class size in an elementary school is 28, and that many of them are actually much smaller. Although of course that doesn't, it's still, per policy, still allows for larger, but in fact, it sounded like across the board, class sizes are in fact smaller at the moment. Is that, I'm looking at Wendy, Bridget.
There's a lot that goes into determining class size, right? And we can certainly forward to you, Bethany, some of the algorithms that we use to identify sort of the average class size, et cetera. So it could be that what we're reporting is more reflective on those nuances than some of the realities that Meredith is describing. I don't know, Wendy, if you've got anything else to add to that.
Yeah, and I think there are certain schools where they have found creative ways to decrease class size, kind of a complicated method if you have overages in certain of your, some subjects you can trade and do different things to get your class sizes smaller. In addition, I know that Dr. Mayo in the fall took a look at some class sizes and did offer additional staffing to many schools where the class sizes looked larger than they had anticipated. So some of those did come down, but it did then create some really late hiring, for schools, which can be really tough.
Sure, yeah, thank you. Ken, do you have a question?
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment because I represent Abingdon Elementary, and we have the largest elementary school in APS. So we kind of get flooded. And one of the ways we're going to have to difficultly address this is drawing the boundaries again. We started, every year we start off talking to the principals and everybody about who's registered. But as you know, you can't stop people on the back end of summer from registering in your district. And they're going to show up. So that's just a product of doing business. So one of the ways we're probably going to have to address it is redrawing the boundaries again, because we're overloaded. We had to hire teachers at the last minute. Those are challenges. And I like everything you had to say, but I go, we got to involve more people to pull this off. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken.
Elaine, we talked a little bit about this in our committee meeting, and I think that you'd be able to offer a more articulate synopsis of our conversation about how class size caps differed from average class size. Elaine's our staff liaison, Elaine Perkins.
Thanks, Meredith. And I just want to again thank our whole committee. We had some great dialogue this year in coming up with the recommendations. I think what we're hearing from teachers and families is that there's a real range across the schools up to the cap. And I think especially this year, as students are returning to learning, I think even one student over what was our previous caps, like in kindergarten, going to 25 or max 26, really does prevent some of the differentiation that we'd like to see in the classrooms. But again, I think there's a real range and it differs per classroom. Mr. Venable, to your point too, when we look at kind of the bigger elementary schools, that it does become a challenge in that students may move in kind of late in the season and continuously throughout the school year. So I do think this is going to have to be a community team effort, but I think we are hearing across the board that smaller class sizes would help address academic and social emotional learning.
Any other questions or comments for Meredith or Elaine? Okay, well, with that, maybe I will grab a minute or two back that I stole at the outset of this. And then I'm going to have to really time keep now, because I'm going to hold the CTAE committee to their 20 minutes.
Bethany, before I sign off, I see some of our fantastic committee members, and Elaine just spoke, and cameras on here somewhere. So can they all get a hat tip can they indicate themselves so that everybody can appreciate the work that they put in?
Absolutely, yes. I see Gail away from you. I see
Hassan, and there's Cameron. So thank you to everybody. I appreciate them.
Yeah, and thank you, Meredith. Thank you for your leadership. Great job. Meredith also did a great job in front of the school board back in November, which is maybe a little tougher audience. I don't know which is the tougher audience, but this one's better.
Questions, but yeah.
All right, thank you. Okay, with that, I am going to turn it over to Rosie and Dan and Chris.
All right, thank you so much, everybody. So I'm actually going to kick off with what Meredith just did, which is to ask that the committee members that are present be recognized. This is a really interesting committee. I've been engaged in this committee for, gosh, well over a decade now, since my kids graduated from APS and before that. And what I really love about this committee is that in addition to amazing parents and alum parents, we have a principal, we have senior staff, we have members of the community very engaged in this committee, and it's very multi-represented. So I'm grateful for everybody that continues to serve and that we continue to recruit for this committee. Also, thank you to everybody who's here tonight, including, I think I saw Reed and maybe one other person from school board. So thank you for being here. And so what I want to do is to, and I also want to say thank you to those of you that have already been providing work-based opportunities to our students in Arlington Public Schools. And I would a special shout out to Alyssa. I think she's here because she has just been, not only did she lead this committee in the past, but she has provided year after year phenomenal work-based opportunities that continue to ground our alumni experiences. So with that, I want you to imagine the opposite end of the continuum that Meredith just presented, right? I want you to take yourself to the point where these amazing young children are growing into the economy of our region, of our country, and global. And I want you to understand that a lot of what we do in CTAE, and you have 2 sets of materials from us that Bethany sent forward, that from this point forward, and just in the last decade, we've seen an explosion of opportunities in the workforce that connect human beings with technology. So no longer can we think about CTAE as a place of where the trades have traditionally lived, but now we look at CTAE through the lens of multiple pathways that are complex, that are requiring tremendous amount of problem-solving capability, emotional intelligence, all of the things that we are curating in APS now and through all of our different curricular areas. So I want you to put yourself in that space when you think about what we are doing here in CTAE. The current and most recent labor market report that was published by the Labor Market Intelligence Unit at Northern Virginia Community College, which is our biggest regional education asset. And I should say in the state, notes that 43% of employers note, no, not 40, employers note that 43% of individuals that are hired into jobs come to them through internships and apprenticeships, work-based opportunities, right? So I want you to kind of focus on that number, because what we are doing is we are creating the new workforce for the region and for this country. In addition, the number one item that employers are noting that is on their agenda as they think about recruiting into the workforce is diversity, equity, and inclusion. So to that end, what this committee has done is propose 2 recommendations to the school board back in November. These recommendations have to do with ensuring that we have an equity lens on high quality work experiences for our students, and that these are going to prepare them for high demand, high wage, high demand fields. So our focus has been to do 2 things, focus on resources and on staffing. And you'll read in the report that our very first recommendation has to do with filling the full-time partnership coordinator position that will create and sustain a pipeline of work-based learning opportunities for all of our students. Now, this is a really important recommendation for us, largely because we've been trying to get this position filled for a very long time, years, as a matter of fact, and APS has already prioritized the need for the resource. This is a resource that is going to support all of the teachers in the middle and secondary programs with aligning opportunities for students and work-based learning. In addition, we want to make sure that we understand that there is already a budget item for this particular recommendation. And what we want is to effectively get that resource in place. It's not possible to put this on the back of teachers. I know that we are trying to be creative with our resources, but it's critical that we have a coordinator position that helps create an accountability structure for all of these opportunities to come into play, and to foster these effective and meaningful collaborations between the resources at APS, the community, programs, students, parents, organizations, the county government, all of the different agencies that support work-based learning and employability of your students as they come out into the workforce. So that's recommendation number 1. And we align that recommendation with the core values of excellence, equity, innovation, collaboration, and stewardship, student success goal, and partnership goal. The second recommendation has to do with staffing. One of the things about our committee that makes us unique is that we're a state required committee, in that we have to report on a regular basis biannually on the Perkins distribution, not related to Elaine. But this is it. We're in the middle of that assessment right now. We had a meeting today. We have another really long meeting coming up next week to continue to do that assessment. That Perkins funding has allowed us to tap into the opportunity of a Cte Specialist. This is a person who coaches our faculty, right? Our teachers in the APS system. And that funding is going to run out. The past 2 years, we've noted that many of our teachers that come into CTE, and this is again a K-12 continuum, come directly from industry, and they come with minimal teaching experience. So one of the things that we're trying to do is skill up the coaches, the teachers that are going to be providing instruction in an equitable fashion to all of our learners, and get them to be the best teacher they can be as they bring with them their specialization from industry. And so it's very important, not only for purposes of quality instruction, but also to help support the monitoring, assessing effectiveness in the education and development, training, coaching teachers, ensuring compliance with federal and state guidelines as part of the work that we're required to do with this funding and on behalf of our students. So I'm going to stop there. This particular plan goal, strategic alignment for this particular recommendation is around engaged workforce and student success in particular. And again, we're all in agreement that this is something that's really important, and that we think about how we are connecting our students with career technical education as they move through the entire education continuum, and how we make sure that our teachers are performing at their best. So equity with regard to the network of opportunities. As many of you know, for those of us that grew up trying to network into our first jobs and our first apprenticeships, we also know that there were many people around us that didn't have that robust network to allow access to opportunity. And so the reason this coordinator needs to come into play is to help identify those opportunities and to expand the network of opportunity for all our students. So with that, I'm going to pause, and I know that I'm keeping to my 20 minutes for Q&A, and Bethany is going to wag her finger at me if I go over. Before we go to Q&A, I want to ask if Dan or Chris have anything to add to that. I refer you to the resources we sent out for additional information. Dan.
I would just emphasize that developing these work-based learning opportunities is especially important for students and families who do not have all of the sort of connections and a network of individuals in the community that can make those connections for them. As I understand it, the process right now of developing these opportunities is pretty decentralized, and much of it is on the back of teachers operating in their particular high schools in particular. And it would be, I think, extremely valuable to have someone who could help to coordinate those processes and work with the teachers and systematically contact employers. I think in our community, there are a lot of employers who would be willing and interested to provide those kind of opportunities, but they need to be asked. And that's particularly important for our students who do not have immediate access to those sort of networks.
One of the things I should add, this came up in our meeting this morning, so this is kind of fresh off the presses. We were doing the first set of evaluations on our Perkins needs assessment, and we were discussing how important it is to meet state standards. Quality CTE requires just a dozen different factors and elements that we need to engage in. Again, it's in the material that you have sent to you, so I encourage you to take a look at it. But one thing that we're noting is that the school system still needs to think about how we put forth the information for access to opportunity to all of our students. And we learned today that there is inconsistency across our comprehensive high schools, our middle schools, and other programs on how we provide, for example, course forms to our students. Something as what you would think is the same at Wakefield, at W&L, at Yorktown, in fact, is not the case. So one of the things we're thinking about is how do we create alignment and consistency and clarity such that all of our counselors, who are tremendously influential in terms of course selection, all of our students, all of our parents know that one school to the next, there is opportunity for all. And so that's something that we're going to be looking forward to the future. But for now, our focus is on the connection of the student with a work-based learning opportunity, of which there are many different models. And that's a primary focus of the coordinator position that we're recommending. Chris?
The only thing I would add is I would add a little bit about the second recommendation, and just a little bit of context on that. We have about 20 teachers that are new in the past 2 years, and we have looked at the research, and the research shows that if you have a coach for those teachers, a direct coach for them, they are more likely to be retained at a 75% rate from their first year to their second year. And so when we start looking at a high quality workforce and ensuring that we're doing a quality CTE program across the board, that coach is very helpful. The other thing that I would note is there are about 16 teachers that she works with regularly. The other ones are new to the system but have some teaching experience. So with those 16, typically a coach has a caseload of 8 that they'd be working with. This one has a caseload double that. So just in context with us with this pilot of trying and seeing how this would work, and to ensure that our teachers and our program are at a high quality for our students. I think it's imperative for the second recommendation as well. The first I agree with as well, but you've heard a lot about that. I just want to give you a little bit more context on the second. So thank you.
Thanks, Chris. And just so I can make sure that everybody sort of understands, there are two recommendations here, and each one has a budget implication, but the first recommendation, that funding already was approved in the APS budget. So it's not the introduction of additional funds that weren't previously there. They in fact have been previously there. It's just that the committee is advocating for the position getting filled. And then in the second case, if I understand correctly, there has been a person in this role, but the funding was coming externally for the person in the role, and that funding is no longer going to be available, and therefore they're really asking for transitioning it into the budget to continue a role that's already been in place. Correct?
Been in place and
Correct.
successful outcomes. Correct.
And has successful outcomes. Yeah. Okay. All right. Fair enough. Any questions from the group now?
I had just a general question. Can you hear me again? Just making sure. Okay. In terms of the first recommendation and that sort of networking, connectivity role, what's the geographic reach of that? Is that beyond Arlington into the region as a whole? Any details on that?
Well, in general, and I'll let Chris speak specifically to kind of the micro details. I know that the work that we do is alongside members of the Chamber of Commerce, alongside industry partners, labor unions, and members of the community, individuals like Alyssa, who opens her private business to work-based opportunities, or myself, when I was at Georgetown, I would open up opportunities, for example, for our prime interns. So the coordinator, when we think about kind of the total number of students in the system, and the students that are particularly focused on completing a whole sequence of courses in CTE, one of the standards that we're measured on is not just completion, but also how much work-based opportunity is available. And with regard to work-based opportunity, and Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but right now we are not meeting state standards with regard to completers and the availability of opportunities. So it's not, the opportunities doesn't exist just in Arlington, but we're large around the region as long as the student has access to that. So Chris, can you speak a little bit about that? Because this is a really important focus point about not meeting a standard that has to be met at the state level, and we have to drive for that standard, notwithstanding COVID dynamics, by the way. Chris?
Right. Yes, I would concur with the information that you gave, is that we are not meeting the state benchmark for that opportunity, and they're looking for sustained work-based learning opportunities. So it's not just there's 13 different work-based learnings if we started getting into them and looking at each of them, and they start from a job shadowing all the way up to an apprenticeship. So when they're looking at a sustained, it's a certain level. So it's going to be an internship. It's so many hours and then above those hours for the student to be out in the workforce or into a work-based learning opportunity. And so, this individual would be going primarily, we've looked in in Arlington, because that's where we could be connecting with our chamber and some of the other businesses that are in Arlington. But we are going to have to look, start broadening that. And I'll use an example with our automotive program. We do have some auto dealerships, out in Tyson's Corner and places like that, where our students are going and doing some internships. So we will be going, farther than the boundaries of Arlington. And this person would help be able to do that. I think the other thing that would be, that's interesting to note as well is, just really, and then we do also have coordinators at the state level. So it would be in connection with those coordinators at the state level that do a specific region. And that would be a connection that would be made as well.
Any other questions?
Oh,
Elisa.
Alyssa, do you have your hand up?
Yeah.
Yes, first off, I want to just congratulate the CTAE committee for digging into the Perkins assessments and evaluations, but also for just driving home the need for this position to be filled. And my question is, what more can we in the general industry do as parents and educators? What can we do to convince the school board that this position needs to be advertised and filled 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago? We've been asking forever. I know it's been budgeted, but how can we make them take this next step, which is to actually advertise and fill the position? What can I do?
Well, I mean,
Thank you.
I-
Rosie,
Thanks,
can I say,
Alyssa.
I was gonna ask the same thing, which is what are the obstacles to fill
Yeah.
the position?
A lot of us get asked to be creative with resources. The truth of the matter is that we're running out of time, right? I mean, our students at Arlington Public Schools are now entering a space of disadvantage writ large, right? If our schools don't commit to preparing our learners for jobs of the future, for giving them access to networks, you know, I am a big believer in walk the talk. We can't just say we're going to be doing equity work and not creating equity systems, right? We're only as strong as the system that we create. So if we're going to say we're going to create an equitable system for all of our learners to go out and become employable in high wage, family sustaining jobs. So I want you to think about cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, the very high skill auto technology. How many of you have been go to the auto show and see the technology that's involved? This is no longer fixing a carburetor, right? This is computer science. So all of the things that are not going to necessarily be available to our students when they go to the next level of education, the 2-year and the 4-year. There are a lot of curricular requirements there. So what we need to do is say, we are leaving our students behind if we do not get them access to opportunities for work-based learning. And it's incumbent on all of us to figure out how to open up our doors, you know, at our employers, you know, within our private practices and businesses to give students that. You know, the two things that we know that are necessary in the workforce, you're seeing it every day in your own jobs. We have to have ability to have great power skills, also known as soft skills, the things that will keep us in the jobs long-term, and the technological skill set to match what we know with how we engage with technology. You pick the field, whether it's healthcare, economics, you know, development policy, you name it. This intersection is here to stay. So I just fundamentally believe that if we don't push for this kind of opportunity for our students and that it is even, we're going to leave people behind. So it's just, if you walk out and you see what the deficit is in Virginia on employable individuals with the skill sets that are required, it's stunning. Last year, the state of Virginia put $30 million on the table for community colleges to educate people, to re-educate and reskill people in high demand jobs. PhDs, masters, bachelors are all flocking to these opportunities because they are not earning wages that they should be earning. We're leaving people behind.
Thanks, Rosie. Chris, do you have any additional comment on that before we wrap this up?
I'm not sure if I can comment any better than what Rosie did, so I will leave it at that.
And Dan?
Same for me. I think Rosie summarized the argument very well, and the importance of identifying these opportunities and moving our students into them. So, thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you to the two co-chairs and to the staff and to all the members of the CTAE committee, and to Elisa for hanging in and continuing to advocate and care about these issues as well. Okay, everybody take a deep inhale and exhale, and we will go to committee number 3 for this evening. And I'm going to invite Melody Mobley, who is the chair of the science committee, to speak.
Thank you so much. this report is perfectly situated. What Rosie and the others were saying about preparing our people, our students, our kids for the future is so important to science, because we're really not doing the job that we need to do. For years, this committee and others have talked about how important it is for the kids to have science work and exposure to nature every day, not just every other year or once a week or once a month. And we're just not getting that done. I'm going to apologize right now. I have 2 dogs with me who are very cuddly. So please forgive me if they pop in and out, let alone if they choose to speak. So with that said, we really wanted to focus on 2 broad recommendations. And we see these recommendations through the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. You all know by now that I was the first Black female forester in the USDA Forest Service and probably in the United States. So I know how challenging it can be to be the first or to not have the skills that you need to reach your dreams. So looking at equity, especially, we've noticed that kids have been really falling behind. We have underserved and underrepresented kids that fell behind even more in science in the past few years than the white kids did. And we see that as a problem, because with what we consider the greatest challenge to the planet being global climate change, we need the best and brightest minds. And that comes from every race, every gender, any category, or any way you can describe people. So we've got to have everybody not just have a seat at the table, but also have a voice. So our first recommendation talks specifically to that, and that's a renewed emphasis on elementary science. We believe that we introduce kids to science too late many times. And by the time they're in high school and getting this renewed emphasis on science, we think it's too late. We think from the very first step a child takes into a schoolroom or onto a computer, if they're doing it virtually, we need to expose them to science. We've got some data, and I should have said this a moment ago, that Dr. Dot Lee has been instrumental in every aspect of this committee's work for a long time, but especially this year when we're dealing with everything virtually. But he's been wonderful. He knows all the data. And if you have questions about that, he'll be glad, I'm sure, to answer questions about that and other things. You all know I'm a forester, I'm not a teacher, but I love kids, and I do go into the classrooms as a volunteer, helping with science and math. And I see these kids really not even meeting our science SOL pass rates. And it's painful because these kids are bright kids. And to see them fall behind, as Rosie was saying, anyone we lose and don't prepare for our future and for technology is a significant loss. So speaking to that recommendation, I'll talk a little bit more in a minute. But our second recommendation really also gets at the heart of things in talking about how we've got to get our kids, our students, outdoor more. Not only the outdoor lab, which is just a real jewel, a gem, but also on our school campuses and other ways, any ways that we can. And the data also show that underserved, underrepresented kids, kids of color, have less time in the outdoors than our white kids do. So it becomes even more important that in school, we not only teach all of our kids of every creed and color, but also get all of these kids outdoors. And I'll just briefly talk a little bit about each of our recommendations. We talked about a little bit of the data that we have that's showing the kids are falling behind. And when I talk about diversity, I'm not just talking about race. I'm talking about students with disabilities, our English learners, our economically disadvantaged students, everybody. And the data show, and you've seen it in the report, that there's been a significant drop. Also, while we think it's critically important to focus on reading and math, science instruction should be just as high a priority, and we believe just as important. So we're recommending that there be at least 45 minutes of science instruction every day on a consistent basis, not just with trade-offs or alternating days, weeks, or months, nothing like that, but every day. We need those kids and those teachers to have adequate resources, good current textbooks. Bring people in as you can, either virtually or in the classroom, that look like them to talk about science. All elementary schools must use standards-based grading. And you all know why. It's so important to make sure that the curriculum's being taught adequately, and that the parents know how these kids are being taught and evaluated. We want elementary schools to use formative assessments each quarter to measure growth and provide necessary interventions when they're needed. And we want to have science coaches at the elementary level, not necessarily one assigned to each school, but at the elementary level, to make sure that these kids are getting coaching that they need. We talked a lot about how some of the teachers need extra training. They're expected to teach science that they're not necessarily prepared to teach. So we think these coaches could really help there and other ways. I'll just close by talking a little bit about our second recommendation. That's outdoor learning opportunities, getting the kids outside. We talked about the outdoor lab a little bit. We know what, again, a gemstone, a jewel that is. But again, we need to take advantage of other opportunities. I personally, just as a volunteer, did some vegetation mapping at a couple of schools. And the kids, when you just take them outside, they see their school in a different way when they know the science of the plants there, what's growing there. Do we have invasive species? Other things that we can really use to see that light bulb go off in their little eyes. We want to continue and increase the use of community organizations for some of those internships that Rosie was talking about, and partnerships to help us make sure that our kids are getting the science background that they need, that good base, so that they can pursue any field they want. Science really opens the door to, I think, everything. And we strongly believe that outdoor learning shouldn't be viewed as just an enrichment activity, but it's a basis for so many things. The very curiosity that child has, their interest in things, what they want to learn, the education that they pursue. And we really believe, again, I'll just close by saying that diversity, equity, and inclusion have to be the thread through all of our activities. And Dot and I, Dr. Lee and I, would love to answer any questions that you have.
Melody, thank you so much. And we greatly appreciate your thoughts on this. And so many things that you said were resonating for me. In my work in higher ed, we used to talk about having college students solve wicked problems. And certainly climate change is a wicked problem, right? And you cannot solve wicked problems if you do not bring to the problem solving a diversity of perspectives and backgrounds and thoughts and approaches and neurodiversity and all those things. So anyway, I will stop commenting myself and open it up to any questions from the room.
Bethany, I'll just quickly say I appreciate what you just said so much. And as you and I spoke briefly in the past, it does take not just having that seat at the table, but having a voice. And we've got to prepare our kids, let them have a voice.
And I don't see any questions in the chat so far. I wonder, Dr. Lee, if you would like to add anything to Melody's comments, and now I do see Rosie has her hand up. So I'll let Dr. Lee comment for a moment, and then we'll go to Rosie.
I don't have much to add. Melody really did a great job of highlighting the core of the Science Advisory Committee recommendations. I do just want to also recognize and send appreciation to our other members, to Megan Ryder, Lita Ernesto, and Kristen Parsons, who worked really hard on the recommendations and asked a lot of questions, really great questions, and did a lot of research. So a lot of appreciation for their great work.
Thank you.
I am mortified that I didn't mention them at the beginning. Please forgive me, and thank you, Dot, for mentioning them. None of this could have been done without them. I'm kind of a talking head here because
that's all right, Melody.
Kids and
all right, let's go to Rosie's question or comment.
Melody, that was a wonderfully impassioned presentation, and I am right next to you on this, sister, because to me the sciences connect all of the disciplines, right? Mathematics, the arts. We used to have a very robust schoolyard habitat program in Arlington. I wonder if that still exists, right? Back in the day, we created gardens and we took students out and did mathematics works with them, measuring, interpretation in terms of the arts, established, social studies curricula, alongside the sciences. And I'm curious if any of these programs are still alive. I mean, I just don't understand. I mean, we're moving into a higher connected world, and I feel that we're stovepiping more as opposed to integrating more. Are those programs still in existence, the schoolyard habitat programs and others?
I can answer that.
Please, John.
And so it really varies from school to school. We have, depending on the teacher's interests, the school's interests, some schools really have excellent outdoor learning space and gardens where they would integrate with science and all other less subject areas for that matter. What we would really like to see is consistency across the board where all of our students have that opportunity. And that's one of the push that we've been focusing on this year. Our outdoor lab staff over the course of the last 10 months did a really good job of visiting all of the schools and doing an inventory and an audit, a very thorough inventory and audit of the outdoor learning space, including pictures, aerial shots. All of this have been shared with facilities and operations over that end. I know that they're also looking at how we can maximize our schoolyard space. Each school is different. Some schools have more space, more outdoor space than others, but the idea behind this is to leverage and maximize what we have. We can't change the schoolyard, but we could think creatively of how we can effectively use it to have more students outside. I know that in this weather, no one wants to think about outdoor learning, but when the springtime comes around, there's a lot of interest in terms of how we can get our students outside and make connections to nature, make connections to their schoolyard. Several schools have gardens, and they've done a really outstanding job of integrating that with the lessons in the different subject areas.
Well, one thing that I would note is, and maybe our social science committee will bring some of this up, but to me, it's cultural connection, right? So many of our students that come from diverse backgrounds grow up in economies around the world that are very connected to the land. And because of affordability, they now live in apartments. So anything we can do to connect their culture to access to the land and through the lens of science, curricula, and other integrated opportunities, I think is more in line with the values that APS is putting out than not, right? So it's not just about equality in terms of opportunity, but it's access to cultural competency.
Agreed. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I want to note, Miles had a comment in the chat just about how they have a great model at Arlington Science Focus School, and it may well be the case that could serve as a model for other schools. And then Christine is commenting that Campbell is an expeditionary learning school, which integrates a number of disciplines, especially sciences in the natural world. And I also want to quickly say that I think, I'm not going to put Shab on the spot, but I think I see Val, I can't see if Dana's here, but that I think that there's conversation in the School Health Advisory Committee as well around the question of outdoor learning opportunities, although my mind's a little fuzzy at this point of the Zoom day. So I don't remember if that's true or not, or if I'm just imagining that they likely are. But what, it illustrates, we find a lot of overlap in some of these committees. Val, I see you unmuted.
Oh, yes, we've talked about that as part of a health push for less screen time, more outdoor time, more fresh air with outdoor learning, integrated disciplines. So we were coming at it from physical health standpoint as well, getting moving, getting outdoors. So there's that angle.
Yeah, that's right. So it seems like we have individual schools that have some potential models. We have some things across schools, and maybe what we're hearing is a little bit more of advocacy around sort of consistent and concerted effort across the system. Any other questions or comments on the Science Committee report and recommendations before we wrap up for this evening? Elisa.
Thank you very much. I would like to suggest that Science Advisory and CTAE get together, because the Career Center's future could include greenhouses. I'm not sure what's coming up at the BLPC next week, but it has had greenhouses in the past and agriculture, urban agriculture. But it seems to me that those two committees ought to work together and collaborate on potential employment opportunities that are not just computer-based, but are computer applications within the natural world for assessments and evaluation and writing literature across the curriculum. We all, as adults, should be reading Last Child in the Woods and The Mother Tree and The Overstory. There's so many great books out there, Up by Roots. But if we don't understand what we're missing, then we really are crippling and not fully educating our children as we head into climate crisis. Thank you for the moment to speak. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Elisa. Okay, I want to wrap us up. Thank you so much to Melody and Dot and all of the committee chairs and liaisons and staff who were with us this evening. I hope that all of the ACTL reps are feeling empowered to fill out their rubrics for recommendations that you've been considering this evening within the next week and return them to me. Of course, I will be sending out email reminders, but I do want to make sure that we capture the response on the recommendations, which is just, it's process, but it's an important part of the process. So thank you, everyone. And with that, we will call it a night.